It started with one single bullet, fired on a bright Sunday morning in June of 1914, that somehow managed to pull 37 million people into their graves. That's not poetic license. That's not a writer reaching for drama. That is the cold, documented arithmetic of what followed, and if you think you already know this story, I promise you, you don't. Not really, because the history books give you dates and treaties and names of battles. What they rarely give you is the feeling of it, the weight of watching an entire civilization walk, eyes open, into the worst catastrophe it had ever created for itself. So let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the world that existed before the guns started firing, because you cannot understand how this war started until you understand what was lost when it did. Europe in 1914 was, by almost every visible measure, at the height of its power. The cities were dazzling. Paris had its boulevards and its cafes. London was the financial capital of the world. Vienna was producing more artists, musicians, and philosophers per square mile than anywhere else on earth. Sigmund Freud was working there. Gustav Klimt was painting there. Trains were crossing the continent in days. Telegraphs were connecting cities in seconds. There was a genuine, widespread feeling among educated Europeans that the age of barbarism was over. That rational men, governing modern nations, would never again throw armies at each other the way their grandfathers had. The optimism was real. It wasn't naive, it was earned. The previous 40 years had been, by historical standards, remarkably peaceful for the great powers of Europe. Trade between nations had never been higher. Economies were intertwined. German banks were financing British companies. British investors were pouring money into French industry. There was even a school of thought, popular among intellectuals of the time, that war between major European powers had become economically irrational, that the financial damage of fighting would far outweigh any possible gain. They were right about the economics. They were catastrophically wrong about human nature. Because beneath that polished, gleaming surface, something old and dangerous had been coiling for decades. The great powers of Europe had been locked in a slow, grinding competition for colonies, resources, and prestige, and they had responded to their mutual suspicion the only way nations seemed to know how. They built alliances. They stockpiled weapons. They drafted war plans. Germany had built a navy powerful enough to challenge Britain's. Austria-Hungary was struggling to hold together a crumbling empire that contained 11 different ethnic groups, each with their own grievances and their own ambitions. Russia was modernizing fast and making everyone nervous. France had never stopped mourning the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which Germany had taken in 1871, and the desire to take them back burned quietly in the French national consciousness like a coal that would not go out. The web of alliances they had constructed was supposed to prevent war through mutual deterrence. If you attacked one country, you attacked them all, and surely no rational leader would start a conflict that would immediately become a war on multiple fronts. The theory was sound. The problem was that it also meant that any conflict, no matter how local, no matter how small, had the potential to trigger a chain reaction that would drag every major power on the continent into the fight. They had built a system where peace required everyone to stay calm, and war required only one person to panic. Now, June 28, 1914, the city of Sarajevo, in the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia. A 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip has spent weeks preparing for this day. He and a handful of fellow Serbian nationalists are scattered along the route that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is scheduled to travel through the city. Their cause is the unification of the South Slavic peoples, free from Austro-Hungarian rule. Their method, this morning, is assassination. The first attempt happens early. A conspirator named Nedeljko Kabranovic throws a bomb at the Archduke's open car. It bounces off the folded convertible roof and explodes under the vehicle behind, wounding several people but leaving Franz Ferdinand untouched. The Archduke, by many accounts, remains remarkably composed. He completes his official visit to the town hall, and then, in a decision that speaks to either remarkable courage or a catastrophic failure of security planning, he insists on going to visit the people wounded in the earlier attack at the hospital. His driver does not know the new route. At a street corner called Latin Bridge, he makes a wrong turn and then stalls the car trying to reverse. And there, standing a few feet away, having given up on the mission and stopped at a nearby deli to eat something before the long walk home, is Gavrilo Princip. He steps forward. He fires twice. Franz Ferdinand takes a bullet to the jugular. His wife Sophie, who was also in the car, takes one to the abdomen. Within the hour, both of them are dead. And in that moment, in that ugly, accidental, sidewalk collision of a failed assassin and a wrong-turn driver, The fuse of the 20th century was lit. What followed was 37 days of diplomatic maneuvering that historians now call the July Crisis, and it is one of the most studied, most debated, most agonized over sequences of events in all of recorded history. Because these 37 days were not inevitable. At multiple points, cooler heads could have prevailed. A different letter, a different phone call, one leader choosing restraint over bluster, and the entire catastrophe might have been averted. But it wasn't. Austria-Hungary, furious and looking for a pretext to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all, issued an ultimatum to Serbia so sweeping and so deliberately humiliating that it was designed to be rejected. Serbia, in a remarkable act of diplomatic restraint, accepted almost every single demand. Almost. One clause, allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to participate directly in Serbia's internal investigation, Serbia said it could not accept, because it would compromise their sovereignty. Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. Russia, which saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, began to mobilize its army. Germany, alarmed by Russian mobilization on its eastern border, issued an ultimatum demanding Russia stand down. Russia refused. Germany declared war on Russia. France, bound by alliance to Russia, was pulled in next. Germany then put into motion a war plan it had been developing for years, the Schlieffen Plan, which called for a rapid sweep through neutral Belgium to knock France out of the war quickly before turning to face Russia in the east. That decision to march through Belgium was what brought Britain into the war. Britain had a treaty obligation to protect Belgian neutrality, a treaty that dated back to 1839 and that the German Chancellor reportedly dismissed as a mere scrap of paper. But Britain had deeper reasons too. A Germany that controlled both Belgium and France would control the entire western coast of Europe, and that was something Britain could not accept. The British ultimatum expired at midnight on August 4, 1914. Germany did not respond. And just like that, the most powerful empire on earth was at war. Within 6 weeks of that wrong turn in Sarajevo, the 6 largest military powers in the world were locked in a conflict that none of them had fully intended, that all of them had partially caused, and that none of them had any idea how to stop. The early weeks of the war moved fast. Armies mobilized on a scale that had never been seen before in human history. Germany poured through Belgium just as the Schlieffen Plan required. The French and British pushed back. There were cavalry charges and bayonet attacks and all the elements of the kind of war that generals had been trained to fight. And then, by late autumn of 1914, the whole thing ground to a halt. Both sides dug in. What emerged from that digging was something the world had never seen before, and has never quite gotten over since. The Western Front. An unbroken line of trenches, dugouts, barbed wire, and mud stretching 450 miles from the English Channel in Belgium all the way down to the Swiss border. 2 opposing armies facing each other from distances sometimes measured in yards, sometimes close enough to hear each other talking. And between them, no man's land. A strip of earth so saturated with artillery shells, so laced with barbed wire, so swept by machine gun fire, that crossing it in daylight was essentially a death sentence. The trench was a brilliant defensive position and an almost perfect offensive trap. Machine guns had transformed warfare in a way that generals on both sides were agonizingly slow to accept. A single machine gun crew could mow down hundreds of advancing soldiers in minutes. Barbed wire slowed infantry to a crawl, keeping them in the killing zone longer. Artillery could shell enemy positions for days, and yet somehow the men in those positions, dug deep into the earth, sheltering in reinforced bunkers, would survive and then emerge to man their guns the moment the barrage stopped. The men who lived in these trenches lived in conditions that beggar description. The mud was not ordinary mud, it was a thick, sucking, chest-deep morass in some places, the product of months of artillery fire churning the Belgian clay into something closer to quicksand. Rats grew fat on the dead. Lice were so universal that soldiers stopped trying to remove them and simply accepted them as part of existence. The smell of rot and cordite and unwashed bodies became so familiar it stopped registering. Shell shock, what we would now call PTSD, was widespread, poorly understood, and frequently punished as cowardice. And through all of this, the generals kept sending men over the top. The Battle of Verdun began in February of 1916. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, designed it as a trap, a battle of attrition intended not to capture territory but to bleed the French army white. His phrase, in a memorandum to the Kaiser, was that Germany would bleed France to death. What he did not fully account for was that the German army would bleed nearly as badly. The battle lasted 10 months. When it finally ended in December 1916, the French had suffered approximately 377,000 casualties. the Germans had suffered around 337,000. The front line had moved, in some places, by a few miles. In others, it was almost exactly where it had started. 5 weeks after Verdun began, the British launched the Battle of the Somme, intended to relieve pressure on the French. On the first day of that battle, July 1, 1916, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties. Of those, nearly 20,000 were killed outright. It remains, to this day, the bloodiest single day in the history of the British military. And it happened on day one of a battle that would last 4.5 months. The numbers from this war are so enormous that the human mind genuinely struggles to hold them. You hear, 10,000 dead, and something in your brain translates it into an abstraction. So let's try to make it concrete. Imagine your hometown. Every person in it, gone. Now imagine that again, and again. Keep imagining it until you've done it 37 million times, for the dead alone, before you even begin to count the wounded, the shell-shocked, the orphaned, the widowed, the permanently displaced. That is what this war did. Back home, the societies that had sent their young men to the front were changing in ways they hadn't anticipated. In Britain, France, Germany, and across the empires, women were entering the workforce in vast numbers, running factories, driving trams, managing farms. The old social order, which had always justified itself in part through the idea that men were the natural providers and protectors, was quietly being dismantled by the war itself. Suffrage movements that had been slowly gaining ground before the war found themselves with new momentum and new arguments. In Germany, the naval blockade that Britain had imposed was slowly strangling the economy. By 1917, German civilians were existing on rations far below what was needed for basic nutrition. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, so called because turnips became the primary food source for millions of people, killed an estimated 700,000 German civilians through malnutrition and related illness. The home front was not separate from the battlefield, it was the other front. And then 1917 arrived and nearly broke everything. Russia collapsed first. The combination of military catastrophe, Russia had lost millions of men in the eastern campaigns, and economic collapse and political rot proved too much for the Tsarist government to survive. The February Revolution of 1917 toppled the Tsar. A provisional government tried to keep Russia in the war. Then in October, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power and immediately began negotiating a separate peace with Germany. When the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1918, Germany suddenly had no eastern front. It could move 1 million men west. France teetered that same year. The Nivelle Offensive of April 1917, launched with grand promises of a decisive breakthrough that would end the war, collapsed almost immediately in the face of German defenses. The French army mutinied. Not in isolated pockets, across 54 divisions, soldiers refused to make offensive attacks. They would hold the line. They would defend France. But they would no longer be fed into the meat grinder for the ambitions of generals who were, it seemed increasingly clear, no closer to winning this war than they had been in 1914. The British were exhausted. The Australians and Canadians who had volunteered in such numbers at the start of the war were being asked to fight battles that their home governments were beginning to question. The introduction of conscription in Britain, Canada, and Australia had fractured those societies politically in ways that would take years to heal. Into all of this walked the United States. For 3 years, Woodrow Wilson had kept America out of the war. His 1916 re-election campaign had run partly on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." American public opinion was deeply divided. Millions of Americans had German or Irish roots and felt no particular loyalty to Britain and France. The Atlantic Ocean felt very wide. The war felt very far away. Then Germany made a series of decisions that made the ocean feel much narrower. The resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917 meant German U-boats would sink any vessel headed to Britain, including neutral American ships. And then British intelligence handed the Wilson administration a decoded telegram that changed everything. The Zimmermann telegram, sent by the German Foreign Secretary to the German ambassador in Mexico, proposed a military alliance. If America entered the war, Germany would help Mexico reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The public reaction in America was volcanic. Wilson went to Congress in April 1917 and asked for a declaration of war. The fresh American troops who began arriving in France in significant numbers through 1918, eventually 2 million of them, were something the exhausted armies of Europe had not seen in years, men who had not been ground down by 4 years of attrition. Men who still believed, because they had not yet learned not to, that this was a war worth fighting and possible to win. German commanders were acutely aware that time was now running against them. They had to win before the American numbers tipped the balance irrevocably. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched its last great offensive on the Western Front. The Spring Offensive, a series of attacks using new stormtrooper tactics, men trained to infiltrate enemy lines rather than assault them directly, achieved the greatest territorial gains the Western Front had seen in years. The British line buckled. Paris came within artillery range. For a few desperate weeks, it genuinely seemed possible that Germany might win the war on the Western Front before American strength could be fully brought to bear. But Germany was running on fumes. The blockade had been bleeding the country for years. The men attacking were the last reserves of a nation that had been at war since 1914. And the Allied response, when it came, was overwhelming. The 100 Days Offensive, beginning in August 1918, drove the German lines back week after week. Germany's allies were collapsing. Bulgaria fell in September, the Ottoman Empire in October, Austria-Hungary beginning to dissolve from within. German soldiers were surrendering in masses. The home front was in open revolt. The Kaiser abdicated on November 9, 1918. 2 days later, at 5 in the morning on November 11, the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France. It would take effect 6 hours later, at 11 o'clock. In those 6 hours, men were still being ordered to attack, still dying. 11,000 casualties were recorded on November 11, 1918, the last day of the war, more than on D-Day in the next war. Some of those deaths came in the final minutes before 11 o'clock. There are recorded instances of artillery batteries firing their last shells at exactly 10:59 and then standing in silence as the minute hand moved. And then the guns stopped. The silence that fell over the Western Front that morning was described by the men who heard it as almost unbearable. After 4 years of constant, rolling artillery fire, a sound so omnipresent that soldiers had stopped consciously registering it, the way you stop hearing the hum of a refrigerator, the absence of it was its own kind of shock. Men wept. Some cheered. Many just stood and looked at the landscape that had been their world for years. The churned mud, the broken trees, the rusting wire, and tried to process the fact that it was over. It wasn't over, of course. Not really. The peace that followed was, in many ways, as catastrophically mismanaged as the war itself. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 brought together the leaders of the victorious powers, Wilson of America, Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, each with their own agenda, their own domestic pressures, their own vision of what the post-war world should look like. Wilson arrived with his 14 points, a framework for a just and lasting peace that included the principle of national self-determination, the idea that people should have the right to decide their own governance. He left having accepted a settlement that violated that principle in almost every meaningful way, in exchange for the creation of the League of Nations, a body that his own Senate refused to ratify American participation in, leaving it toothless from birth. The Treaty of Versailles placed the entire legal and moral blame for the war on Germany, the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. Germany was stripped of territory on its eastern and western borders. It lost all its overseas colonies. Its military was reduced to a rump force. And it was presented with a bill for war reparations that was, by virtually any economic analysis, impossible to pay in full. The intent was to guarantee that Germany could never again threaten the peace of Europe. The actual effect was to create in Germany the precise conditions, economic devastation, national humiliation, a burning sense of injustice, that a demagogue could exploit. Among the German veterans who came home from the war in 1918 was a 30-year-old corporal who had spent much of the last 2 years carrying messages along the most dangerous sections of the front. He had been wounded twice. He had been awarded the Iron Cross First Class for bravery, a rare honor for someone of enlisted rank. He was, by the accounts of the men who served with him, unremarkable in most respects, quiet, solitary, intense about politics in a way that his fellow soldiers found slightly odd. He was recovering from temporary blindness caused by a mustard gas attack in October 1918 when he heard the news that Germany had surrendered. He described the experience of hearing that news as the most devastating moment of his life. His name was Adolf Hitler. The treaty that was supposed to prevent another war had instead planted the seeds of one. The map that was redrawn in Paris in 1919 created new nations with old ethnic fault lines still running through them, left millions of people, Germans, Hungarians, Bulgarians, on the wrong side of new borders, and produced a region of Europe that one historian called a zone of instability, that would take another war, and another 30 million dead, to finally resolve. The four empires that had gone to war in 1914 were gone. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all dissolved. In their place were new nations, some of which had never existed before: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, the Baltic states, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine. Every one of these new entities carried within it contradictions and conflicts that would take decades, in some cases centuries, to work through, and some of which are still being worked through today. The war also changed the way the world thought about war itself. The poetry that came out of the trenches, Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Estate, Siegfried Sassoon's searing satires, the laments of a dozen other poets who had survived, captured something that no war poem had quite captured before: the specific horror of modern industrial killing. The patriotic glorification of combat that had characterized the literature of earlier wars seemed, after the Somme, simply obscene. A generation had grown up being told that to die for one's country was the noblest thing a man could do. A generation came back from the trenches, those who came back at all, having seen what dying for one's country actually looked like. The gap between those two things was too wide to bridge with rhetoric. And yet the world did not, in the end, learn enough from it. 20 years after the armistice, the machine was turning again. New flags, new slogans, new uniforms, but the same failure of imagination, the same addiction to force, the same inability of men with power to find any way forward except through each other. 37 million dead from the First World War, 70 to 85 million from the Second, 120 million people, roughly, in the space of 30 years, killed by the same fundamental failure, the failure of human beings to choose, at the critical moment, any path other than the one that leads to catastrophe. The war that was supposed to end all wars instead taught the world how to fight the next one better. We are still living in the world that July of 1914 made. The borders of the Middle East that fracture the news every decade trace directly back to deals made by Britain and France in the aftermath of the Ottoman collapse. The European project, the entire extraordinary experiment of nations that once slaughtered each other choosing to bind themselves together through law and trade and shared institutions, was born from the determination that the 20th century's two catastrophic wars must never be allowed to happen again. The United Nations, the rules-based international order, the entire architecture of modern geopolitics. All of it is, in some essential sense, a response to the question that the First World War forced the world to confront. How do you build something that makes this impossible? We're still trying to answer it. Because what the First World War proved, more clearly, more brutally, more completely than anything that had come before it, is that the same civilization capable of producing Beethoven and Shakespeare and the Sistine Chapel is also capable of producing Verdun. That the same rationality that built the electric light and the steam engine can, when aimed in the wrong direction, engineer the perfect conditions for mass death. That progress and barbarism are not opposites. They can coexist. They can even feed each other. The silence that fell over the trenches on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918 was not the sound of a problem solved. It was the sound of a world trying to catch its breath before the next round. The only question that has ever mattered, the only one that still matters, is what we choose to do with the time in between.